Today, we're in for a treat. We have the original host of Savvy Psychologist, Dr. Hendriksen, here to chat with us about her new book. If you're self-critical or struggle with perfectionism, this is the episode for you. In it, we discuss how perfectionism is defined, how social media can potentially negatively impact it, and ways to move towards self-acceptance and feeling like you're enough. Welcome back to Savvy Psychologist. I'm your host, Dr. Monica Johnson. Every week on this show, I'll help you face life's challenges with evidence-based approaches, a sympathetic ear, and zero judgment. I'm sure you're super excited. I was super excited as well to find out what she's been doing since she's been gone. And one of those things has been writing another book, which I've been spending my holiday season reading, and it's called How to Be Enough. And so, Dr. Hendriksen, can you tell us what led you to this book? Who is this book for? What's it about? We're really excited to hear about it.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm excited to be back. This feels like home. I've been spending a long time writing this book, and it's about, as the subtitle implies, self-acceptance for self-critics and perfectionists. And I wrote it because, I write about my own problems, first of all, so I wrote this book for me. But my first book was about social anxiety, and the chapter that really resonated with readers and audiobook listeners was, hopefully the whole book resonated, but I got a lot of feedback about perfectionism and how, wow, I never thought about that before. Like, that really is the heart of social anxiety. And so that got my nerdy brain interested in perfectionism. And as I, learned and researched more about it, not only started to resonate myself, I was like, oh, I think this explains a lot about me, but also really helped me be a better clinician and understand my clients on a deeper level. I'm a clinical psychologist at an anxiety specialty center. Nobody ever comes in and says like, Ellen, I'm a perfectionist. I need help. I need help with perfectionism. Everything has to be perfect. People come in and say, I'm not reaching my potential. I'm not really doing things well enough anywhere. Like, I have so many things on my plate and I feel like I'm not doing any of them well, or I feel like I'm always failing, or I feel like I'm falling behind. There's just this silent, or not so silent, in the therapy room epidemic of not feeling good enough. And that truly is the heart of perfectionism. It's not about striving to be perfect. It's about never feeling good enough. And so I wanted to learn more about me, but also write this to help all the folks who I sit across from, in the office, and what I'm guessing to be many, many, many folks just like them.
Based on the research that you've done, how would you define perfectionism? Because I see a lot of different things in the media.
I'm really glad you asked that. Yeah, no, because perfectionism, I feel like, can be good, right? Like, it's everybody's favorite weakness in a job interview. Like, what's your biggest weakness? Oh, I'm such a perfectionist. And indeed, it can be good. The heart of healthy perfectionism is a personality trait called conscientiousness. And that is a tendency to do things well and thoroughly, to be responsible, to be diligent. I call it the world's least sexy superpower, but it is indeed the one to choose for, research has shown, for a good life, both objectively and subjectively. So healthy perfectionism is when we aim high, strive for excellence for the sake of excellence. We care deeply. All those things make the world go round. Please keep doing those things. Where it tips over into unhealthy perfectionism is when we start to do two things. And now we're getting into the work of Drs. Roz Shafran, Zafra Cooper, and Christopher Fairburn from when they were colleagues at Oxford University. And there, they say the two pillars of unhealthy perfectionism are self-criticism, which I think needs no definition, but in perfectionistic self-criticism is particularly harsh and personalistic. And the second pillar is something that was actually new to me, and that was a tendency called over-evaluation. And that is when we start to conflate performance with our character. So it's when we conflate our worth with our performance. It's like, I am what I do. And so one of my lines is, forgive my grammar, but it's when I did good equals I am good, or I did bad equals I am bad. And we can over-evaluate anything. So classic examples are the striver student who derives their value from their grades. I had a client who came in and he was very anxious, like disproportionately anxious about his quarterly evaluation, we finally figured out that it was because he saw it not only as a referendum on his work, but on his own character, like his person. I'm working with a musician right now who botched a performance recently and is taking it to heart because he is only as good as his last performance. We could think of the athlete who's only as good as their last game. We can really over-evaluate anything. It could be how healthy we ate today, whether our social performance, whether or not we were awkward at the holiday party. And so over-evaluation is whenever we think we have to perform as superbly as possible to be sufficient as a person. And that's really the heart of unhealthy perfectionism.
It's so great that you bring that up because so many of my patients are coming to my mind as you're talking about that, especially because there's such a push for productivity and like hustle culture and that sort of energy. And so a lot of people start to identify with their achievements in a lot of different ways. So I'm wondering, do you have any tips for the over evaluation or the self-criticism?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the overvaluation, I had a lot of fun researching and writing this story in the book. I tell a story about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and his time at UCLA with the legendary basketball coach John Wooden. John Wooden's record with the team was so superlative, so exemplary that these two researchers, Drs. Roland Tharp and Ronald Gallimore, sat in the stands for the 1974-75 practices just to see what Coach Wooden did. Like, what's the secret sauce? How does he do this? How does he get such a good performance? Speaking of performance, out of this team. And what they discovered was, interestingly, that he very seldom praised or criticized his players. He didn't say things like good job or like no, like you stink. Instead, what he did was he taught. He gave information. And so he would say things like pass from the chest, take lots of shots where you might get them in games, pass the ball to someone short. And it was almost never focused on the person or the player. It was focused on the action and the job at hand. And so what we can take from that playbook is to focus on the work for the work's sake. We're never going to completely separate ourselves from our work. Of course, we're going to be proud of a good performance. Of course, we're going to be disappointed when things don't go as we wanted it to. But if we can make our performance less personal and make it about the work, to like take the stance of a sculptor eyeing a block of marble and say, what would make this thing better? What would make this work better? That will get us a long way. And ironically, striving for excellence for the sake of excellence, as opposed to prove ourselves, usually makes the work better.
Oh, wow. That's a profound thought to have because I know so many people are looking for the praise, and even what I said about kind of the push for productivity and things like that, we're externalizing so many things. If I don't get enough likes on something, if I don't have enough people telling me I did that thing really well, then it makes me feel bad about myself and that I'm not enough.
Right, right. And I think you've hit on a really important point there because then when we do externalize it and we base our self-worth on the praise or the admiration or the likes, we've outsourced our self-worth to other people, to the reactions of others. And that leaves us in a very low power position. Whereas if we focus on, again, the work for the work's sake, on what we can control, that puts us in a much higher power position. By focusing on striving for excellence for the sake of excellence, we can do a double whammy. And not only probably will the performance actually be better, when we don't have our own self-worth wrapped up in it, but also we're not outsourcing it to the people around us. That helps buffer us in two ways.
Are there any tips that you have for how to shift your mindset in that way of like, I'm doing this for the sake of doing it?
Yeah, no, definitely. So it's really easy in 2025 to determine what I should be doing based on social media, on the opinions of others, on things that might not even really be our own values. I was talking to another podcast host, and she was reflecting on how she always felt like she had to follow this rule of like, I need to have a beautiful home, even though she had two toddlers. And so she would see these like beautiful interiors on like Pinterest or on Instagram and think, oh my God, that means now I have to do this too. And it really like lifted the weight from her shoulders when she realized that's not even what she wanted. She wanted a climbing wall in her living room. She wanted to have her toddler's toys everywhere. Like she wanted a welcoming, active home, not a kind of generically beautiful home. And so I think it can be much easier to focus on the work for the work's sake when it's something that we either want to do or, this is not a perfect world. We can't do things we want to do all the time. In the things that we do have to do, like our paid work or whatnot, to find the thing that we do value about it, the thing that we find meaningful or important or fun, and to run towards that part of the work. And that is how we can focus on the works for the work's sake, as opposed to, trying to make this, again, a referendum on ourselves.
It seems like part of what you and I are both bringing up is that the perfectionism isn't just something that exists within the person, but it seems to be also a response to another person, the greater society, those sorts of things. So it doesn't just seem like it's a personal problem. There also seems to be an interpersonal dynamic that can happen with perfectionism.
For sure. Yeah. No, I mean, and this gets into some of the work of doctors Thomas Curran and Andrew Hill. So they had this really interesting study come out in 2019 where they tracked 27 years of data and tracked to what extent are people being perfectionistic, in our society. They found that it is on just a rocket launch of a trajectory. It makes sense. Every human reacts to the situation they're put in. And so when we find ourselves in a uber capitalistic society where we are encouraged to achieve and perform and compete to ever higher standards, then of course we're going to respond with some perfectionism. But interestingly, when we put all of our eggs in the basket of performance and feel like we need to perform so well that we are set apart, that we are different than everyone else, then ironically, we end up alone. So we might be singular, but we also end up separate. That, I find, is what brings a lot of people into the office, that they feel like on paper, they might look like they're hitting it out of the park. They're doing a lot of things well. They are thriving, but they don't feel like it. They feel lonely. They feel isolated. They feel separate. And I feel like that is one of the true side effects of a society that makes us strive and perform and achieve to ever higher standards.
And I find that really interesting because, we see all of these headlines about the loneliness epidemic that we're in. And to hear you make that connection between striving for perfection and how it leads us towards a pathway of being more lonely. Because I don't see any performance standards around community. You know what I mean? No one's going like, hey, let's make friends and have that be a goal, or let's have a thriving, abundant community that supports us. And that's an achievement. Doesn't really align with where we're at with our American values.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, no, and it's also really ironic because, perfectionism is what researchers call interpersonally motivated, meaning it's actually trying to help us belong, but it is guiding us down the wrong path to get there because it tells us the lie that we have to perform as superbly as possible to get people to like us. But let's think about why your friends are your friends. Are you friends with them because they're good at things? Is it because they're skilled at conversation, or they always pick a good restaurant, or they always remember your birthday? None of those things are bad, but I'm guessing that's not why you like them. Probably you like your friends because of how they make you feel. They make you feel connected and supported and like you can be yourself. But perfectionism, the lie of perfectionism tells us to double down on performance, even, our social performance, striving to be articulate or to have good taste or to be stylish. It tells us that we have to double down on that performance in order to earn our way into belonging, as opposed to, focusing on connecting, focusing on just simply enjoying each other. Plus, when we double down on performance and try to put our best foot forward, that also implies that we're hiding what's not going so well. And that's called perfectionistic self-presentation. When we show what's going well, we hide what's going poorly. And then that makes us unrelatable, right? It makes us come across as superhuman or intimidating, and that continues to contribute to us being isolated and disconnected. Perfectionism might look like a personal problem, but really it's an interpersonal problem. There's, again, that we might be singular, but then we're separate. So what we can do there is to try to pump up the vulnerability. And I know that that is a word that kind of gets tossed around a lot. We can define vulnerability as being willing to reveal thoughts, actions, emotions that could result in criticism or rejection, but taking a leap of faith that they won't. Like with the people we want to be closer to, thinking about the word vulnerable literally. Being vulnerable is being at risk. We put ourselves at risk when we disclose something vulnerable, but it's letting people see some of the mess, and it signals two things. So being a little bit vulnerable signals, I trust you. I trust you not to judge me or to reject me. And it also signals we are the same. I am not better than you. We're not in some kind of like coach-mentee relationship. We're not in a teacher-student relationship. We are equal. And that is what the foundation of friendship, is built on, trust and equality.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm glad that you bring this up because something that I see happen a lot is, when people are trying to be vulnerable, they trauma bond instead. They're like, let me tell this new person my deepest, darkest secret. And then when they are rejected, because that's not the best way to go about doing that, then that increases like negative feelings about yourself. And so part of my story is I'm a DBT therapist. So part of what I do is radically open DBT, which is for people who are over controlled. And we have something called the match +1 skill. So what I say, what I say to my patients is, okay, where is your starting point with this person? +1 it. Like go one step beyond, where your relationship is with that person. And then once you're connected on that level, you keep doing that until you reach a spot where it's like, it no longer feels good or right to move forward another step.
Amazing. Yes. Love match +1 for sure. Disclosure, vulnerable disclosure is, personalistic for sure. It should be about us. But like you said, that we don't want to take that all the way to the trauma bonding, first, because getting to know someone is also reciprocal. We say, here is a little bit of my mess. I trust you. We're the same. And ideally, that person will say, oh, yeah? Oh, well, here's a little bit of my mess, too. Now we've done this reciprocally. And then keep going as you are comfortable or as you would like to get to know this person. Make sure that the level of disclosure remains roughly equal. Absolutely.
And so this brings me into something that I'm always trying to do, which is like kind of bust myths, because there's a lot of myths that I see floating around online. What are some things that you see going on in terms of what people are doing for perfectionism that probably isn't working very well? And then maybe we can talk about what to do instead.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm so happy you brought this up because, imperfection is having a moment, which I think is amazing. And I have noticed that the advice around perfectionism tends to be along the lines of, hey, you need to stop when things are good enough. You really need to lower your standards. And because the heart of clinical perfectionism is that over-evaluation, is seeing ourselves as defined by our performance, that's not going to resonate with somebody with perfectionism. We're absolutely not going to settle for what we perceive as a subpar or mediocre performance because that would make us subpar or mediocre. So I think it's absolutely important that imperfection is having a moment, but I think telling people to lower their standards or settle for good enough is not going to go off well. And I've certainly seen that in the therapy room for sure. When I first started learning how to treat perfectionism, many moons ago, I suggested to a client that he have an 80% productive day instead of a 110% productive day. And he looked at me like I had just suggested that he pull out his toenails. So I think we need to be careful about how we phrase that. And so what we can do instead is to make some room for mistakes. And that's different than lowering our standards. Keep your high standards, keep striving for excellence, but know that we can't have zero mistakes. I'll tell a story about a client I have who is a pediatrician. And so she came in the other week and was just lambasting herself about having made a misdiagnosis. And, her job is very important. You would not want to tell her to lower her standards. She would never settle for, I did some, good enough care of patients, or like, I missed a few things, whatever. Like that's not appropriate. However, she's been doing this for 25 years. By all accounts, she is an excellent doctor. But with this particular case, she had misdiagnosed appendicitis, which was, pretty serious, for simple constipation. And so she had sent this patient home, and then she ended up needing to go to the emergency room later. Everything was fine, but my client was being so hard on herself. She was saying, I should get my brain examined. Maybe I should retire early. Like, I'm a terrible doctor. And so there we talked about, like, okay, keep your high standards, but what's over a 25-year career, what's the percentage of misdiagnoses that you would be expected to make? It can't be zero. And so she decided that, like, even just 1%, even just allowing herself a tiny bit of wiggle room makes a huge difference between that and 0%. I'm never allowed to make any mistakes. So we're keeping the high standards, but folding in some room for the inevitable blips and bloops and errors of life, not because we're not good enough, but because we're human. Mistakes are part of what's going to happen. Sometimes things don't go well.
And I'm glad you bring that up and you separate those two things, because oftentimes when I'm working with people, they usually have idols that they look up to, and none of those idols have a perfect record. I'm like, if you look at Michael Jordan or Simone Biles or Jeff Bezos or whoever it is, Nikola Tesla, it's like they've all failed a lot. They've all lost a lot of games, but we still look at them as some of the best in whatever their field is.
Right. And weirdly, I think that the fact that they have failed or have struggled or have not always hit it out of the park makes them more relatable and more even aspirational. Like, I think when we're looking up to someone who does seem perfect, they somehow seem superhuman. It's not even possible to aim for that. And so I think when we look at the best of the best and see that they have struggled, ironically, makes it more likely that maybe we could reach great heights like that as well. They can be the best of the best and still be human.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So in reading your book myself, I think your book is good for anyone. What would you say, to a person thinking, oh, I don't know if this perfectionism thing really like matches me? Because when I was reading, I was like, I think we all, to some degree, like fall under the self-criticism or the over-evaluation.
For sure. Yeah, no, I think, again, most of the people who I see in the office absolutely have some perfectionism. And I think it makes sense. It's, again, we all react to the situations we're put in. So anyone living in 2025 in, our society is probably going to have some of those same reactions. I think specifically self-criticism is something that everybody can relate to. And there, I take the subtitle of the book pretty literally, the self-acceptance for self-critics and perfectionists. But there, I want to emphasize that everybody criticizes themselves from time to time. In fact, self-criticism is the core of humans' ability to self-regulate. So, a healthy dose of self-judgment, helps us evaluate our behavior, modify it, and ultimately get along with other people. So, we can't stop criticizing ourselves, but what we can do is to learn not to take it so seriously or so literally. For example, I know that my brain is wired just to be a little bit more self-critical than the average bear, just like some people are wired to be introverted or extroverted or optimistic or pessimistic. I think a lot of us are wired to be self-critical. But I think that is key, that we can say, oh, this is just how I'm wired. When the self-criticism starts going, we can think this is just what my brain does. It doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean these are facts. It doesn't mean I have to listen to it and like go on some self-improvement journey. I can just treat my self-critical thoughts sort of like I treat the music at a coffee shop. It's there. I can hear it, but I don't have to, metaphorically sing along. I can just let them pass through my brain and be like, oh, that's right. That's what my brain does. That's how I'm wired. And I know for me, that true self-acceptance, knowing that this is just how my brain is wired, has helped me not take my self-criticism as literally. And that is very freeing.
I love what you're saying because there's a lot of nuance in it. I think a lot of people think that they have to remove parts of who they are versus learn how to accept and like live with them. And what you're describing is what I say to my patients all the time about we want to take the bite out of it. So the bark is always going to be there. It's the bite that really hurts. And by using these interventions, that's what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. We can do that with self-criticism. We can do that with fear of failure. We can see it as this is something my brain does. And we don't have to exactly lessen those things. We can, instead of trying to change them or make them go away, we can change our relationship to them. And like this gets into acceptance and commitment therapy and the technique of cognitive diffusion. But there I've had, great success with clients and help them sort of play with their self-critical thoughts and make them like a little bit irreverent or a little bit ridiculous, like not to make the thoughts go away, but to just emphasize that they're thoughts. For example, like I have a client who likes to picture Animal from the Muppets, like banging his drum set and like yelling his self-critical thought, which is everyone will judge you. And then I have another client who takes her self-critical thought, which is you're going to let everyone down, and pictures it like on a coffee mug. And then she'll picture herself taking a little sip from the coffee mug whenever she has that thought. So the thoughts are all still there. We're doing some true self-acceptance here, but we can play with the thoughts to emphasize that they're just thoughts. They're not some indictment of us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here today and talk about how to be enough. Anyone who wants to get your book, where can they find it? When is it available? Do you have any social medias where people can know what you're up to and what you're doing?
Sure. Yeah, it's out January 7th. And you can get it wherever you like to get books. It's in hardback, ebook, audiobook. So if you're not tired of my voice, you can listen to me narrate the book. To find me online, the best place where I post most often is my Substack, which is called How to Be Good to Yourself When You're Hard on Yourself. And you can also find me on Instagram.
Oh, this is so wonderful. Thank you again. Everyone, please go out and purchase the book. I was lucky enough to get an advance copy, and it's been a great read, and I'm definitely going to be recommending it to some of my patients.
Well, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me back. It feels like home, and it was a delight to talk to you. Thank you so much.
You. If you decide to read How to Be Enough, let me know. You can contact me via Instagram at KindMindPsych or via my email at psychologist@quickanddirtytips.com. The Savvy Psychologist is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. It's audio engineered by Steve Rickyberg with script editing by Brandon Getchus. Our podcast and advertising operations specialist is Morgan Christensen. Our digital operations specialist is Holly Hutchings. And our marketing and publicity associate is Davina Tomlin. Nathaniel Hoops is our marketing contractor. Follow Savvy Psychologist on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's all for this episode of Savvy Psychologist. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.